going to speak about the Arab Gulf, and I have 7 points to make in 7 minutes, so I'm going to try to be brief. First, as Mayor pointed out, um, the Iranian attacks on the Arab Gulf states um, is an attempt to use them to put pressure on the Americans and to a certain extent Israel to stop the war. And I think that the evidence the Iranians had that this might work was obviously in October 2025 when Israel attacked Hamas's leadership in Doha, and Qatar was able to put pressure on Israel through the offices of the Trump administration, and this resulted in an Israeli apology. And so I think that the Iranians believe that they could repeat this, and this is why they've targeted the Arab Gulf. It's important to point out they've targeted American bases, American diplomatic embassies and consulates, but they've also attacked civilian targets in these states, hotels in Bahrain, Dubai, and elsewhere. And they've also began targeting, as Mayor also pointed out, the energy infrastructure of the Gulf, which is to a certain degree critical to the health of the global economy. This Iranian strategy has basically foiled the policies that many of the Arab Gulf states were pursuing for the last 5 years, which was oftentimes referred to by experts as détente between Iran and the Arab Gulf states. But I think a better way to think of it is appeasement. The Arab Gulf states were hoping to purchase immunity from Iranian attacks by pursuing a closer, tighter relationship with Iran over the last few years. That policy seems to have failed with the outbreak of war. My third point is, when we talk about the Arab Gulf these days, we have to think about it and talk about it differently than we did 30 or even 20 years ago. We have to think about them as states. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, especially when you talk about Gulf security, these states have different threat perceptions, they have different interests, they have different self-images. There are vastly different sizes in terms of population and territory, and have different categories of wealth. And just to take two quick examples, there are various differences between the Gulf states on the question of Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, and relations with Israel, particularly since the October 7th war. And we've seen that play out in tension between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia in January and February leading up to this war. So I think it's important when we talk about the Arab Gulf to recognize that there's significant differences between them in terms of policy and perception. My fourth point is it's important to think about the Gulf states today as pursuing independence in terms of their security policies. They no longer see themselves as dependents. So if when the Gulf Cooperation Council was founded during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates were roughly 10 years old as states. They were 20 years old during the first Gulf War in 1991. Today, they're much more mature states, and I think they're pursuing independent security policies in a way that's very different than it was during either the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s or the first Gulf War of the 1990s. And what that means in practice is that the United Arab Emirates has been attacked with 200 Iranian missiles, more than 1,000 drones, and has been actively and successfully, for the most part, defending its own territory. And you could say similar things about, in a much more limited way, about Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. And so I think that aspiration to be successful in terms of national defense suggests a much more mature state. And I think what they're trying to do now is deter Iran without provoking greater escalation, to defend themselves, basically. And I think that's an important point. They're not pursuing Israeli or American protection. They want to demonstrate they can protect themselves. And that's related to my next point, which is the question of solidarity between these states, these 6 Arab Gulf states. It's true they tend to circle the wagon in a time of crisis or war, support one another, at least in rhetoric, if not always in practice. But I think in terms of the time of solidarity, if there ever was one in the Gulf, is usually short-term and temporary, and I would argue even to a certain degree superficial if we're thinking in terms of security. Why is that important? Because if and when there gets to be a time when this war is winding down, I think we're likely to see post-war dynamics that are much more competitive than cooperative, meaning I don't think we're going to see a sustained Gulf solidarity moving beyond this war. That brings me to my two last points, Israel and the United States. It's very clear that today, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, at least publicly, and I would argue even beyond publicly, are not comfortable operating in what one Kuwaiti professor referred to as Israel's orbit of power, which means that despite the fact that there is cooperation, for example, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Israel would do well to be discreet about its strategic cooperation with Arab Gulf states and others. Right now, and I would argue in the short to medium term, there's no appetite for an open security alliance led by Israel. Their perception, or the perception among some of them, is that Israel dragged them into this war. And to their minds, if Israel and the Americans succeed in their goals with respect to Iran, that potentially they're exchanging Iran's aspiration for regional dominance. And again, I don't think this is correct, but this is their perception of Israel with an Israeli aspiration for regional dominance. And I think that Israel would be mindful of that in how it pursues its relationships. Finally, with respect to the United States and the Arab Gulf states, the Trump administration has brought the United States back to the center of regional politics. You could argue for a good 15 years from the Arab Spring up until the October 7th war, the U.S. sought to reduce its role and engagement in the region. Now we're seeing a very active and almost dominant U.S. role. And I think that creates the new dynamic between the Gulf states, which are now trying to harness American power in service of their various and diverse interests. And I think that pattern of behavior is likely to continue even beyond the war, which means that there will be continuous competition between the various Arab Gulf states to sort of push the U.S. policy in a direction that favors their various interests. And we've seen this play out over the years, even before the war, whether it was Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, or Saudi Arabia. And I think that will likely be the pattern of behavior moving forward.